Good morning to my US attendees and good afternoon to my Southern African attendees. We at Shared Interest are thrilled to launch the first of our community conversations on racial justice series today during Black History Month. This discussion is the first of a 5-part series that Shared Interest is hosting to raise awareness and resources for Black businesses. My name is Ann McDougall, and I'm the new Executive Director of Shared Interest. My organization was founded more than 28 years ago by anti-activist Donna Katzen. Our organization has focused on supporting the very businesses that are so critical to a COVID-19 recovery, Black-owned small and medium-sized enterprises. To date, Shared Interest has provided more than $30 million in guarantees that has unlocked more than $125 million in loans for low-income Black-owned businesses. These efforts have benefited more than 2.3 million beneficiaries from low-income communities. When I became the executive director, the board of Shared Interest had recently passed a racial justice resolution that required us to redouble our commitment to the fight for racial and economic justice in Southern Africa. This conversation today will illuminate the importance of fighting for human and economic rights that are embedded in the constitutions in the US and South Africa. Today's speakers are more than up to this task. I am thrilled and humbled to introduce 3 leaders who have a global expertise on this subject. Our moderator today is Gay McDougall. She is a human rights attorney and independent expert for the UN Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. She will be joined by Justice Albie Sachs. He's a freedom fighter, writer, and justice of the South African Constitutional Court. Rounding out our speaker panel is attorney Benjamin Crump. He is affectionately known as Black America's Attorney General. He has defended Trayvon Martin, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. Gay, I will turn it over to you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello, I'm Gay McDougall, and I am so honored to be the sort of moderator, if you will, on this, which is the first of a series of conversations to explore commonalities and critical differences between movement strategies and objectives in South Africa and the US at this very pivotal time in both countries. Now to begin. Justice Sachs, we have known each other since the late 1970s. And Attorney Crump, we are meeting for the first time, but I hope that I do know your work very well, and I've used it in the work that I do at the United Nations. So I hope that we can all be on a first name basis for this encounter. Let me also say that, our time is unfortunately far too short to begin to delve into the issues before us. So I think it would be helpful if we all join together to keep our interventions relatively brief. So let me start. To both Ben and Albie, what do you see as the major threat to democracy in South Africa and the US? And what differences would you point to between the fight against for racial justice in the US and the fight against apartheid in South Africa? If I could maybe turn first to you, Albie.
Okay, I'm going to defy you from the very beginning and go a little bit off script because, you are my old friend from 50 years ago when apartheid was at its most virulent. And you were siding with a distant, rather unknown organization called the African National Congress, promoting not only the release of a not very well-known figure at that time, Nelson Mandela, but helping us to envisage a new legal system for a democratic South Africa. And I still remember having intense debate with you on whether or not the ANC should sign on to the Geneva Convention protocols that recognize liberation movements as parties. And it was such a fascinating and rich debate, simply to say that, you know, in those days in South Africa, the whites behaved like a majority and treated the black majority as the minority. And the whites are still a minority in South Africa as they were then, but then they controlled all the levers of power. The black majority has the vote, a brilliant constitution, breakthroughs all over the place, and yet economically, and to some extent even in terms of self-confidence and socially and culturally, the whites still have that huge legacy of being on top and behaving as though somehow their position is okay and some black people can join them up there on top. And I think that's the source of the tensions in our country. It's vastly different to the US in one significant way, that the black population in the US, who we are discovering already more than anyone else, the founders of the US are still a minority. And there have been some breakthroughs, and they're not unimportant in the 50 years. A hell of a lot of progress has been fought for and won in the US, but still the racism is entrenched, still it's very, very powerful. In terms of the threats to democracy, how they tie in, I would say the major difference is the biggest immediate threat to democracy in South Africa is coming from a proclaimed left that has been disgraced, has been dislodged from positions of power for looting and for corruption and for betraying so many of the things that we fought for, fighting for their lives and trying to prevent themselves from going to jail through using the terminology of the left. In the United States, it seems to me the biggest threat to democracy is coming from the right. I won't mention the names of any particular figures except the initials are DT. And the threat is not from him, it's from the millions who are supporting him. Astonishing, a kind of retrograde, making America ugly again, not great again, and reinforcing all the themes that were so horrid about the United States, putting the country back in that way. So I'm not sure what it does in terms of the comparison between the two countries. So, there isn't, but the progressives on your side, and there are millions and millions who marched in the Black Lives Matter and beyond that, and there are millions in South Africa, are not obvious allies because the way they face up to the issues appears to be different. But deep down, we are allies at the level of humanity, at the level of social concern. And I think all of us recognize that in our respective countries, without economic justice, political justice is not only precarious, it's very incomplete.
Mm-hmm. Ben, what would your response be to the questions and to all that Albie has just said?
Well, certainly. Thank you again, Gay, for having me. And Albie, I'm honored to participate on this panel with you. I believe, like in America, one of the problems and many other places around the world, and I suspect that South Africa would be no different, a major impediment to economic equality is the denial of access to capital. We are involved in litigation in America. My law firm in particular on behalf of African Americans and other minorities to have equal opportunities at access to capital with banking and finance. When you look at the data, forget all the diversity, inclusion programs that they promote and such. Let's say, what is that producing? You can't tell me where we're working on financial literacy, we're working on diversity, equity, and inclusion, but we see the same results with the number of people who are getting access to capital to start businesses to try to even the playing field. We're in Black History Month, and it was profound to me when I was preparing to give a speech at one of the universities, and I went back and looked at some of the commentary of the father of Black history, Carter G. Woodson, and he talked about how when they attack people of color and Black people, we have to understand our history. There's a reason why we have this economic inequality. He talked about how America, for one, would give all the peasants from Europe 40 acres and a mule, access to all the land they could ever want. But when it came to the peasants from Africa who were brought to this country involuntarily and who worked for 200 years for free, they denied that upward mobility with this government set aside. I mean, can you imagine just the ownership of land, which in many places the greatest economic engine in the world? It gives you generational wealth. I mean, back in the 1800s, those families could then bequeath it to their children, and their children could bequeath it to their children. Well, African Americans never got that access to that kind of economic injection. And so till this day, we are lagging behind, and the government has done nothing to try to even that playing field. In fact, Albie, it is arguable that the government has continued to set up obstacles for business, minority business people in America. And I would suspect that may be the case in South Africa when you have a few people who have the economic clout. And in America, it's less than 1% of all the wealth in America is controlled. I'm sorry, 99% of the wealth in America is controlled by less than 1% when you look at the raw data. And that 1% is not only given a grant of economic superiority, but the government protects them with all kind of benefits to make it harder for others to take pieces of the pie. And so I would say this, I think about what we're seeing in the social justice world. And Gay, I think I had an opportunity to present before the United Nations in the aftermath of George Floyd. I think you may have been one of the justices. And I remember talking about after George Floyd was killed, it was such a galvanizing force, not only in cities across America, but in cities across the globe. You had everybody saying that until we get justice for George Floyd, none of us can breathe. And so it was multicultural, multi-generational, multi-geographic. I mean, you had everybody coming together as they saw this video saying, we're better than this, America. We're better than this to our children. And what I tried to do, Gay, is seize upon that opportunity. All those corporations who pledged billions of dollars, Dr. Denise Mitchell and I and our law firm, we're trying to hold them to account. You say
Well,
you
this
set aside this money, and we're going to make sure you give that money to the people who have historically been marginalized and disenfranchised.
This actually brings me to my next question, and that's that we all, the murder of George Floyd created a moment, if you will, and that had impact all around the world. And one of the trends has been the commitments from both public and private sector to demonstrate solidarity by investing in communities of color. And I think the question before us and that you just raised was, how can we ensure that these commitments are backed by action that drives sustainable change in enduring structural, in changing structural racism, so that we don't have to come to this moment again? How do we move from receiving charity, if you will, to actually getting a sense of ownership that we can then move into the future on our own terms?
And that is a profound question, because I think so often social matters impact institutional matters. And I think when George Floyd happened and people watched that video, and for 9 minutes and 29 seconds, they thought they was watching something from Hollywood, a horrible theater scene. And they all believed that certainly the police would take his knee off of this human being's neck. And regrettably, they saw that police officer, Derek Chauvin, didn't offer George Floyd any professionalism, any consideration, and worst of all, Gay, he did not offer him any humanity. And so we all watched that, and we could not unwatch it once it became a permanent stain on our brain. And you have many white people say, oh my God, I can't imagine doing that to another human being. Now, Black people have said for decades, this is what was happening, but George Floyd let them see it, and it provided ocular proof of what we have been saying. And that social justice tragedy then evolved into other parts of society. For the first time, I had American corporations, about a dozen, reaching out to me to come and give speeches on what they could do to renew their commitments to social justice. And one of the things, we have to be very careful when they have these emotional moments to be able to get sustainable institutional change. And so many times what I would do is talk to these corporations, and I would challenge them on who are their D10 officers. In America, the tax code requires that you have to list out your top 5 executives. And most of those corporations, to the tune, Dr. Mitchum, of 99%, are all white people. I mean, when you talk about the Googles, you talk about the Chevrons, you talk about the Bank of Americas, you talk about the Chases. I mean, you have to go so far down the pole before you see the first Black person. And so you challenge them on that to say, if you really are committed to diversity, it shouldn't be something we just talk about. It should be something that we see. So we talked about that first, but then we talked about the investments into devoting capital and opportunities to Black people to make the Declaration of the United States real, when they say we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equally, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that amongst them are life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness. Then corporate America, that means Black people too. That means brown people too. That means Native people too. And you hold the mirror to their face and say, the Declaration can't just be rhetorical, it has to be real. and the fact that when we look in this mirror, we don't see any inclusion to make that declaration be real. And so that's what we've been doing, Gay, and we've been keeping a report card, Dr. Mitchum and I.
Okay, let me just move to my next set of questions. You know, and this is really for both of you. In the wake of Archbishop Tutu's death, many people in South Africa, as well as here in the US, in considering his legacy, particularly have been looking at his role on South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which of course has been replicated in a number of countries around the world. I want to ask each of you, starting with you, Albie, what lessons from that model, the TRC model, might have benefits for healing the wounds of the centuries of racial injustice here in the US? Albie, what would you say would be helpful, maybe not helpful?
Okay, I think there are huge positive lessons and some quite strong negative lessons. And the positive lessons, to my mind, are three major lessons. The one is it's enormously and listen to the truth, to hear the pain and to acknowledge the pain. And whether the pain was inflicted on you, you were the people who inflicted the pain, whether you were a bystander, because the pain was real and it continues to this day. Its legacy, it's transmitted from generation to generation. Connected with that is the Truth Commission. The power came from listening to the voices. The commission went into the poor communities, to a church hall, started off with the poor people, often walking barefoot to the hearings, and Archbishop Tutu would begin with a prayer and some songs. People felt comfortable and at home. This is not a cold, formal court of law gathering facts to put in a record. This was a location where people could speak out what they'd experienced. And that phenomenological aspect, the experiential aspect, was absolutely fundamental. It wasn't the data, the facts, they're well known. It was what an American scientist called converting knowledge into acknowledgement. And in the US, the knowledge of slavery is there, of the abusers, but it's presented in a cold, factual, detached way. The acknowledgement comes from inside. And the acknowledgement wasn't just those who had suffered, who had lost breadwinners, lovers, children, but acknowledgement from the perpetrators themselves. To get amnesty, they had to come forward and own up. And that was absolutely vital, owning up to what happened. So that's the one whole interconnected dimension, the phenomenological aspect of it. The other was, it was very important that the process be hosted by people of integrity, credibility, not running for office, not to score points, not to denounce enemies, but to help the nation to heal. And that's where Desmond Tutu played such a marvelous role. You don't want a neutral person. You can't be neutral in the face of brutality, of torture, of violence, assassination. You can't be neutral, but you can be impartial. You can listen to everybody. You can encourage everybody to speak. That was a second major aspect. And I think these are very transportable, these aspects. The part where I think we failed the most was part of the balance for giving amnesty to people who've done horrible things was that there would be some form of reparation for the victims. Now, in a sense, our whole nation had been victimized, or 9/10 of the nation. But people have been victimized in a particularly brutal and awful way. And so some kind of reparation was required. And that was converted simply to a lump sum of money to each that was quickly spent. The reparation should have been much wider. It should have involved corporations. Where were you? What were you doing supplying weapons of control, having police informers in your factories and your mines and so on? What can you do today that's relevant? People in the community should have been involved. There should have been much more prepare in terms of the living circumstances of people, in terms of what they could dream of and imagine, and much less saying, okay, you've got your money, it's over now, now we can get on with business as before. And I think that was a major fault. It was a completely unimaginative approach to the question of reparations. And I think that's a worldwide problem. When you market, you turn pain into merchandise, you put a price tag on it, and it's all wrong. There's never enough money. They belong to different realms. Sure, compensation, economic support is absolutely vital, but much more than that is needed than reparations in terms of lump sums. I think that was our biggest weakness. Another weakness very much, and I'll end with this at this stage, very much commented on, there were rascals and crooks and torturers and assassins who didn't come forward to the Truth Commission. Some came forward and they weren't believed, and they didn't get amnesty, and they haven't been prosecuted. So something got lost in the balance, the equilibration of the whole process. But overwhelmingly, it was enormously valuable. Tutu's leadership was so rich. It played a huge role at that stage, important moments. And the ultimate failure hasn't been so much the Truth Commission's failure, but the failure to reconstruct our economic system in a way that makes people feel we're beyond the exclusion, the marginalization, the disrespect, and the inhumanity.
That's very interesting. You know, the part that I think that we are failing at now, we're putting the truth out, but the acknowledgement is being resisted almost violently. You know, even the nonviolent resistance to what people are calling critical race theory. But the truth is under great peril in the US. Ben, what are your thoughts about the truth and reconciliation model for the US?
I think it's a very good precedent for us to follow because, as you have just articulated, this critical race theory is trying to have a historical reversion where they don't talk about the atrocities of slavery and the vestiges of slavery on people of color, especially African Americans. And I think that you learn from everything. I think South Africa learned when they were doing their constitution, some of the things that worked most profoundly in the American Constitution. And then I think hopefully America, as Abby said, can try to develop something to the essence of truth and reconciliation and have an economic component in that, because I do believe that African Americans have been denied reparations for decades now, and we continue to have this economic inequality on every level. And that's why I think this organization is so needed, because we need to learn about investing in our community, investing in our motherland in Africa, and trying to uplift the culture of people of color and not being ashamed to say it. Oftentimes, we talk around the issues. We have to be unapologetic in our demand for respect to Black life and Black liberty and Black humanity. And the last thing I will say on this here is, Ben Franklin said, democracy is like two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for lunch. You don't have to be a rocket scientist to know how that vote is going to go. But he said liberty is making sure that that lamb is well armed to protest that vote. So what I think we have to do, especially during Black History Month, and as we reflect on history, to learn from it and not make the same mistakes that we made previously, we have to make sure that young lambs of color are well armed with, not with guns and violence and bullets, but well armed with intellect and strategic thinking and diplomacy to be able to protest the prison industrial complex that have them as the target, to protest this economic inequality that would deny them the basis for life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, to be able to protest the healthcare inequalities, be able to protest the environmental racism that will have communities of color suffer the greatest injustices that are generational, Gay. When we talk about the contamination from factories into a community, well, that passes on from one generation through another through the DNA. And so in essence, what we have to do is make sure that our children are more intelligent than those who will seek to oppress them. And I think that has to be an aspect of truth and reconciliation as we continue to evolve, along with the economic component. And we're suing right now in court against Harvard University for reparations. And if we're successful, it will be the first reparations case in the United States of America where an American institution has been made to give reparations to descendants of African slaves.
Okay,
Wow.
could I just say a little bit about critical race feminism in the Constitutional Court of South Africa? In about the year 2000, I had an African-American law clerk named Sharon McPherson, and the case was the unconstitutionality of the crime of sodomy. And the issue was, is it unconstitutional because of equality or privacy or dignity? And I said it's all three. And she introduced me to the concept of intersectionality and critical race feminism. There's a footnote. And in fact, that theme was picked up recently by our court in insisting that domestic workers be entitled to occupational injury compensation, protection for that, not simply because they were Black overwhelmingly, and women overwhelmingly, and poor overwhelmingly, but the intersectionality of all three, the experience. And it so happened that many of our judges were born to domestic workers. We're of that generation. So they wouldn't need to read books. They would understand why this particular section was vulnerable and why you shouldn't use formalistic reasoning to say, hard luck, you're not covered by the Bill of Rights because you're not targeted as women, you're not targeted as Blacks, you're not targeted because you're poor. And the court held just last year that it's the intersectionality picked up from critical race feminism, picked up from the African American whom I had the luck to have as my law clerk at that particular moment. So I'm not sure that American courts are quoting intersectionality in great numbers, and certainly not the Supreme Court. But you'd be happy to know that it's migrated to South Africa and it's become the law.
Well, that's very interesting. I have to take a note on that. And I would say that there have been some justices of the Supreme Court that have had sensitivity to intersectionality. Ruth Bader Ginsburg is, among them. Unfortunately, though, the court is going in the other direction right now.
I'm working on trying to get the right selection for the first African-American woman on the United States Supreme Court as we speak.
Which would be wonderful, although she will be a voice among the minority on the court.
Gay, I would say this, I would submit this humbly. As Frederick Douglass said, without struggle, there can be no progress. I remember a time when there was no voice for us and we were able to overcome it.
That is true. Listen, look, let me just, because you both touched on the question of youth. Every mass movement for change gains its energy from the activism of young people. I think of the Soweto uprisings. I think of the Black Lives Matter youth who've taken over the streets here after the murders of Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, George Floyd. What key lessons, and I want to start with Albie here. What key lessons?
Can you start with me because I'm gonna have to leave.
Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, Ben, please.
Yes.
What key lessons from the anti-apartheid struggles would you offer young people here in this country who are fighting for racial justice? What can we draw from what we know happened in South Africa to be the next set of pushes for our kids in the streets here?
I think there are many things that were learned from the anti-apartheid movement. In fact, one of the things I remember when I was much younger was the response of Blacks in America demanding that American corporations divest from South Africa until they got rid of apartheid. I think we have learned from the Montgomery bus boycott, economics plays such a vital role in all these movements. And I think that the young people and the young energy is always going to be the fuel because, they don't have to worry about losing jobs and all these things because they are still young enough to believe that they can change the world. And I pray that, we continue to create generations, every generation say we can do better. And so in conclusion, I would say that these young people have to learn from history, but they have to continue to be courageous. I think so often John Lewis really was a Black Lives Matter activist on that Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma. They just hadn't created a thing called Black Lives Matter yet. I think Nelson Mandela was a Black Lives Matter activist in South Africa. They just hadn't created a such thing as Black Lives Matter. And so I think in many ways, that is an inspiration to the young people because I think somewhere out there in South Africa or in one of these cities across the US, marching, demonstrating, fighting for George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Trayvon Martin for equality in South Africa. There's the next Nelson Mandela. There is the next John Lewis waiting for the world to discover them. So I thank you very much. Ahmaud Arbery, the young man who was lynched for jogging while Black here in Brunswick, Georgia. We're on verdict watch, so I have to get to the courtroom on that. Thank you all so much for having me, Ann, and to all Gay, Albie, it was a true honor.
Well, it was a true honor to have you here. And, I've got my fingers crossed that the, court will do the right thing on Ahmaud Arbery. And with your help, I'm sure we got the best chance. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, and good luck to you and Ahmaud Arbery's family as well.
Thank you. God bless you.
And Ben, you've got my support from far away Cape Town. We follow on the TV and we're excited And it's not always that lawyers have that sense of solidarity, because often they're lawyers on the other side, and sometimes they're lawyers on our side, but they're a little bit ugly in the way they do things. And I love the way you present issues, the way you spoke about the land. That's such a big issue in South Africa. And I wish you strength, and courage with your battle that lies ahead.
Great. And as he leaves to rush to the courtroom, maybe Albie, I could spend a couple of minutes further with you, because I do want to go back to this question of the lessons learned from the anti-apartheid movement for young people here now in the U.S. What lessons do you think would be very important for them to consider? Where did the kids in South Africa, wind up going down, the avenues of brick walls, and where did they do of what was absolutely the most important thing at the time? What translates to us here?
Gay, I'm thinking of the things that I feel most precious in our struggle. And it can be speaking to friends and comrades in the Black Lives Movement in the US. It can be speaking to Palestinians, speaking to people to Myanmar. Very different conflicts, but all, being oppressed, marginalized in some way or another. And what were our special qualities? And one of them was, I can't quite put my fingers on it, but it was a quality of humanity and humor, and I'd say even fun, that we never lost. Mm-hmm. We never lost. There were jokes in our struggle. There was a lot of laughter. There was a sense of tenderness in our relationships that went often with abusive relationships. It's really to say, if you're fighting for humanity and for human rights, don't lose your own humanity. Be willing to cry, to laugh, to be tender, to embrace, to think. That was a very rich quality. I came from, if you like, a revolutionary tradition from Eastern Europe. It was marvelous. It was millenarian. It was disciplined. It was structured. It was liberating the world. But wow, it could be very dour, implacable. The revolution was some kind of mighty force outside of ourselves. And that human quality, I think, came from an African, it's called Ubuntu today, that resisted imprisonment on Robben Island, the brutalities inflicted on our people, the exile, the harshness. That's something, and there's lots of it in the US, but sometimes people in the struggle are ashamed of having tender souls. And kindness. They feel you gotta be tough. And I'd say softness sometimes is much stronger than strength and hardness, more resilient, more enduring. So that's one kind of elusive intangible. With it was a kind of unity. We achieved. There were splits, as you will know, the ANC, the PAC. There were some splits inside the ANC, but somehow the idea of the broad church, epitomized by Oliver Tambo and Nelson Mandela, reaching out to a very wide range of people and finding the points of commonality, fighting injustice. And I think that was very important for us. Minimize the number of your enemies, maximize the number of your friends, neutralize people where you can, Don't be totalist in your vision. Then something very important, I think, is it seemed impossible in South Africa. If you graded South Africa, the US, and Palestine, Israel, in the ranks of countries where real change and democracy could come about, we would have come last. With 300 years of overt colonial racist domination, with our leaders locked up, the torture, with the dispossession of the land, and with that visible sign of distinction that was not simply in the mind, it was in the law. Who would have given us a chance? And yet we never lost that hope and determination, that belief, and to find our own particular ways. And then the last point is the importance of leadership and the quality of leadership. Looking back, it's always easy to be retrospectively clever and saying we saw it all the time. But leadership of a kind that's not the leader, the messiah, the icon, but a leadership that listens, that is participatory, that enjoys having strong people around them. I think these were some of the characteristics of our very top leaders, and a kind of genuine humility in the face of what they're involved. I was asked in Mozambique at the time when Samora Machel was the top leader. I was told by somebody very close to Samora, that Mozambicans can't understand who's the top leader in South Africa. Is it Nelson Mandela or is it Oliver Tambo? And they found that very confusing and worrying. So not long afterwards, I was working with Oliver Tambo. We were revising the statutes of the ANC. And I said, excuse me asking you this question, Comrade OR, Oliver Reginald, we called him OR. But I've heard that the leadership in Mozambique are concerned to know who is the top leader in South Africa, of the South African struggle. Like a shot, he said it's Nelson Mandela. He's the commander-in-chief. Now, Tambo was the acting president of the organization. In constitutional terms, he was the top. Straight away, he said it's Nelson Mandela. Years later, I meet Nelson Mandela, he's just out of prison. And somehow I get an opportunity to put the question to him. And straight away he says, Oliver Tambo. Oliver Tambo. Not to make a point, not to get a headline, but that was exactly how they felt. So I think it's those kinds of qualities that are created by the struggle. They don't create the struggle, but they epitomize the best of the struggle. They articulate it, and they are great presenters, but they're even greater listeners.
Well, Albie, I think that is a absolutely phenomenal point to end this dialogue. You and Ben have given us all shared interests and beyond some incredible food for thought. And I want to thank you for being here and for doing this. Yes, we go back 50 years or so, and every time you and I have an encounter, it's always a memory that I put in my don't ever forget that category. And so, too today, you've said a lot of things that I think that we all should never forget. And Ben has as well. He's doing some important work now. I've got my fingers crossed. So again, we will stop there. Thank you so much, Justice Albie Sachs. Yeah, you have your hand up. Yeah.
Yes, I was cheeky at the beginning and I'm going to be cheeky at the end again. Can I just give a little plug for shared interest? I'm not a member, I'm not on the board. I don't think I've even made a contribution to it. They do terrific work. And it's the total other, the opposite of the grand philanthropy. The grand philanthropy is up in lights. They want to be known. They want to be acknowledged. They get things named after them. And this is at the other end. And it's small amounts to people who are marginalized, even marginalized within the struggle community,
Right.
Marginalized very much on grounds of gender and of poverty and where they live and lack of formal education. And they are the ones who are being empowered with these, what be tiny grants. They're the kind of things that American banks wouldn't even bother. It's not worth the paperwork because the amounts are so small, but it's huge in the lives of the people. And the people that shared interest attracts, working with them, and the style of work is so admirable. It's the other side, if you like, of America. It's the other side of the ugly, powerful, bombastic America in every way. The smallness, the focus, the connection with the humblest and often the most marginalized, and the modest style of working. So I'm making this plug because I admire so much what they're doing, and I was thrilled to meet the new CEO of the organization. I think an absolute coup to have her working in this particular area. And it's also lovely, Gay, you wouldn't mind a personal compliment, to see you in such fantastic, fabulous form and looking so well and so poised. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Albie, for all that you have done, for all you continue to do. We will close this program now. Our thanks from all of us to Shared Interest for making these times, this conversation possible. Thank you.